All right. So the way I've done this, and John may have shown you a lot of this before, but basically we need this is referred to as hot foil because it takes an element of heat to get this stuff to come off of the acetate. So all the foil is laminated to a kind of carrier sheet of acetate. And what that needs to do is crinkle just enough and separate and adhere itself to your print. The way they typically do that is through the typesetting, where the lead type is heated up and just the pressure from the type going into the soft paper will be enough. You want to cut, when you cut off your sheets, you want to cut enough that it's that you've got more than enough to cover the area. Don't try to be too frugal with this, because you're going to want enough to cover your imagery. And then what I do is I end up saving the used sheets, and I bring them back to the studio, and you can burnish it into drawings, or you can use it again and kind of laminate the opposite of what just came off sometimes. It just depends. But you need some kind of polymer that, like acrylic binder. The Guerra 50H medium. Guerra paint is this great acrylic paint company out of New York. If you can afford to buy all Guerra paint, it's really nice. But their medium works really well. And the reason is because it's got a pure concentration of that acrylic polymer. So it will dry, and you can print it in different thicknesses. It will dry, but then it will also become tacky again under heat. So what I've got on this, so what you need in any print is basically a separation. So this was a proof from that earlier print I showed you. The front, if we did, the front has 2 layers of silkscreen ink. If we did this side, it would go everywhere. It wouldn't just be distinguished by the different graphics, because it's all acrylic. So if it's going to stick to anything, it's going to stick to everything on there. So I'm going to use the back side, which is that crinkled paper pattern. But if you pass this around and kind of feel, if you didn't feel the surface earlier, you can feel the dry parts of the paper, which should not carry the foil, to a little bit of the stickiness that's on there from the acrylic screen printing ink. So that acrylic ink, depending on how old it is, and this one's pretty old, I'm going to see how much it can be activated by heating it up. On a hot plate, usually, or on most hot plates with this, you want it to be around 220 degrees, okay? Which I didn't think of is way below what your paper is going to burn at. Does anybody remember what paper burns at?
Like 280 or something?
No, it's a famous book.
450.
450. So you're way, but I was worried. But you can scorch the paper at 200 and above. So you want the hot plate to heat up, but you don't want to put your stuff on there until you're ready to laminate. So have all your materials together. But they recommend around 220. This has been an invention for some time in commercial printing. The artist who kind of brought it to fine art printmaking was a professor at University of Iowa, Virginia Myers. And she keeps much more of a kind of hold on it as like a kind of specialized technique. She's passed away now, but I believe she's passed away if we put that on there.
We will do the research.
But
and find out.
I'm pretty sure. But there's still an associate or a visiting artist position at University of Iowa that is sponsored by her and this technique. So you would take the job with your MFA, is supposed to be an emerging artist, and you can learn this technique and then teach at other places. I never took that workshop. We bought some of her supplies. The Guerra paint is from one of her supply lists, but I kind of had to mine that from her student workers and ask questions. But it's essentially a lamination process. You could do this with a little laminator if you wanted to. What you need is heat from the bottom, heat from the top to make sure things get heated evenly and tacky, and then you'll get a good lamination. The pressure isn't really important, but she sells a special hot plate and a special roller. But what you want out of those rollers is basically those red fuser rollers from a laminator or from a photocopier. Those are that's the rubber that can heat up, so you've got a surface from the top and bottom. We're gonna cheat and just use a regular hot plate and an iron, which works pretty well. But what you wanna make sure is there's definitely too much heat and there's definitely too little heat. Too much heat will do the same as too little, all right? So it's an experiment. Virginia did all kinds of techniques where she would laminate a whole sheet on black paper and then you would scratch through the foil as a way to make a drawing. Most of the time I just use it as a way to add a little bit of a graphic punch, or in the work that I like to do, if things are foiled and they're backlit, it has all this different kind of optical effects. You've got the reflective material, so it creates a kind of, you know, shininess that relates to like gold leaf and Byzantine icons and things like that. So that's why I like using it. Let's see, any questions about that?
Actually, yeah, can you go back to what you were talking about, laminating a whole piece and then, I guess, cutting it away, you know, like.
Yeah, she tried to make a
effectively
scratch
erasing
board
it,
out of
yeah.
it. She would try things like that. And that's a, you know, you could do, the reason I mention that is because, you know, it's something to be, it's a medium to be experimented with like any other. There's a process for it. The real standardized process is with type, where if you want a wedding invitation with a little glitz, they'll get it hot foiled. Some of that type will get hot foiled in there. That's the standard way of working. This way of working, where we're combining it with acrylic medium and using hot plates and made up rollers, it's more inventive, it's more experimental. So I'm just telling you that because you got to keep a little bit of an open mind. Like the snake prints that I showed you, those did not work very well. I used, usually when you do this, you want a lower mesh count screen to screen print that medium. I happened to use a higher mesh count screen on there. It didn't come through as well, but then I went through and hand painted with the medium, let it dry, and did another layer of lamination, and it worked just fine.
Now, what's the lowest screen would you go?
I would go, you could go, you know, as low as you want. I think I've done it on 80. You know, the problem is then you've got a big glob of medium. And usually what I do with the medium is dye it so that we do acetate overlays to register our prints. If you just screen print that, you're not going to really be able to see anything. It's just transparent. So I usually add a little color to it, a little red, or whatever you want. And some of that will show through. The lower the mesh count, the thicker the screen, or the thicker the ink application, you might just see some of that medium around the edges. That's all. But the more medium you have down, the better the tackiness of that.
So what about the whole subject of, I always thought you didn't put like acrylic on top, you know, like you don't put thin on top of fat.
With this? Like with foil on top of acrylic? Is that what you're saying?
No, I'm talking about oil-based inks, adding acrylic on top of oil-based inks. Is this still an archival process? I mean, do you feel like you've got archival quality stuff?
Well, when you're combining it, that's what I was telling John. It can be combined with anything. You want to leave open paper or open surface where you want to put the acrylic down. But you can screen print over oil-based ink as long as you, the way we would always do it is you would take a sheet of high grit sandpaper, 400, 600, 800, and score the top, like kind of abrade the top surface of the print after it's dry. Not in a way that's going to distort the image, but in a way that's going to pull up the paper fibers through the oil-based ink. So on painting, the problem is with the oil over acrylic is you usually have no exposed surface for the acrylic to go, and then if it sits on top of the oil oxidizes and shrinks, and the acrylic dries out, and so those are two different drying processes. So the cracking will come straight through, whereas you can use the acrylic as a primer. But the problem with that is that there's no, when you paint with oil or paint in general, you usually cover the whole canvas. So there's no no surface for the of the substrate. When you make a print, you know, you've got thin, can I borrow this for a second? You've got thin and thick layers of ink, but then you've got a lot of, you know, this is a lot of plate tone, but that's mostly paper, all right?
So that's where you're saying the foil needs to be applied.
Yeah, or you could, when you're printing, if you're making the print, when you're printing it, if you want the foil to go into a specific spot, burnish that back so it's polished away. You know, so good spots on this print would be any of the polished flat white areas. We could do it all along the background too, but I would say we would want to do some proofs where that's really polished away really nicely. But the acrylic over the oil is definitely a concern, but
Yeah.
not as much of a concern on paper because you still have so much of the substrate exposed. If you were able to paint a canvas in oil and then selectively leave open spots for acrylic, you'd be fine. But it's the idea of the acrylic not having anywhere to go to or dry on top of.
And I like what you're saying with the sanding. And another thing, if you think about it, if you're trying to be more precise on your sanding, instead of a sheet, you can get one of those nail filers. And those are really high grit
Oh
sand.
yeah, the emery
And-
boards?
Yeah,
Yep.
and you could use that to take out areas and you'd have a little bit more control. So for those that like doing your nails, bring some of those in. And that might be a thing to think about because then you'd have a little bit of control like you would with your vernishing tool. And so.
Yeah, the polished metal where you don't have, when you're wiping the plate and if you can get that as clean and white as possible, that's where there'll be enough paper, you know, plenty of paper for that acrylic to sit if you want to combine it with oil-based inks.
And we can
Yeah.
do that.
The reason though you would want to do oil and acrylic, like let's say we use like I don't know what it's called, you know, some of the water cleanup oil-based inks that they have. I don't know how much acrylic's in there, and then if you went to foil with that, you might get the whole, it might be more like this. What you need when you do this is some kind of distinction. So if you've got like acrylic ink, like a silk screen, and then you do the medium, the whole thing's gonna remain tacky. But with the oil and foil combination, you've got two distinct areas. The foil is not going to want to stick to the oil-based ink when we heat it up. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. Okay.
So let's see what we've got in terms of heat.